Just after midnight on March 2nd, 2026, something happened in the Strait of Hormuz that had never happened before. Not during the tanker war of the 1980s, when hundreds of merchant ships were hit by missiles and mines. Not during the oil shocks of the 70s. Not once in the entire recorded history of modern shipping. The tracking screens went blank. For the first time ever, not a single tanker inside the world's most important waterway was broadcasting a position signal. 20% of the planet's oil supply, the fuel that fills the tanks of Tokyo, powers the factories of Shenzhen, and sets the price of gasoline in Ohio, simply stopped moving. For 50 years, the world's energy analysts had treated this exact scenario as a kind of ghost story. Iran had threatened to close the strait in 1980, in 2008, in 2011, in 2018, in 2019, and again in 2025. Every threat was priced in, analyzed, and dismissed. The consensus was almost a law of nature. Iran can never actually do it, because closing Hormuz would strangle Iran itself. Presidents believed it. Markets believed it. Insurance underwriters in London built billion-dollar models on it. And then, on February 28, 2026, American and Israeli aircraft opened a war by killing Iran's supreme leader. And within hours, the ghost story came true. Radio warnings crackled across the strait on VHF channels. Tankers turned around mid-passage. Traffic collapsed by 70% in 2 days, and then effectively to zero. Oil prices would soon rise faster than in any conflict in modern history. Faster than the Gulf War, faster than the invasion of Ukraine. Here's what makes this story bigger than one war. The Strait of Hormuz has been the single most valuable piece of water on Earth for 500 years. And in those 5 centuries, it has had only 3 real masters: a Portuguese empire that taxed it, a British empire that policed it, and an American navy that guaranteed it. Each one believed its control was permanent. Each one was wrong. And as of today, July 2026, with a ceasefire in ruins, an Iranian toll booth operating in the world's busiest oil lane, and American destroyers hunting mines by night, the honest answer to the question, who controls the Strait of Hormuz, is nobody. For the first time since 1507. This is the story of those 21 miles of water. How they were won, how they were lost, what they cost, and what happens to a global economy when the jewel falls out of the ring. Because to understand why 6 ships, 6, passed through the strait last Sunday, you first have to understand why, for half a millennium, everyone who ruled the world felt they had to rule this place first. Look at a map of the Persian Gulf and you'll see the problem immediately. The Gulf is essentially a cul-de-sac, a dead-end sea, 800 kilometers long with exactly one exit. That exit is a bent channel squeezed between the Iranian coastline to the north and the Musandam Peninsula, an exclave of Oman to the south. At its narrowest point, the Strait of Hormuz is just 34 kilometers wide, 21 miles. A commercial airliner crosses it in 3 minutes. But the usable part is far smaller than the map suggests. Deep draft supertankers can't wander freely. They follow a traffic separation scheme. 2 designated lanes, each about 3 kilometers wide, 1 inbound, 1 outbound, separated by a buffer. Think of it as a 2-lane highway serving an entire hemisphere's energy needs. Through those lanes in a normal year, pass roughly 20 million barrels of oil every single day, about 1/5 of everything humanity consumes, along with 1/5 of the world's liquefied natural gas, almost all of it from Qatar. The geography gets worse the closer you look. The deep channels run near a scatter of Iranian islands, Keshem, Larak, Hormuz, and further west, Abu Musa and the Tunibs, which sit beside the shipping lanes like watchtowers beside a toll road. Iranian anti-ship missiles on those islands don't need to be advanced. At these distances, a weapon from the 1980s works fine. The strait is, in military terms, the world's most perfect ambush. And the customers at the far end of this highway are not who you might assume. In 2024, 84% of the crude oil passing through Hormuz went to Asia. China alone receives roughly 1/3 of its oil through the strait. Japan gets about 70% of its Middle Eastern crude, which is to say most of its oil full stop, through these same 21 miles. India, South Korea, Thailand, all customers of the same narrow channel. Europe, meanwhile, quietly depends on it for 12 to 14% of its liquefied natural gas, the share it bought from Qatar to replace Russian pipelines after 2022. which creates the strangest strategic geometry on the planet. A waterway physically controlled by Iran and Oman, militarily guaranteed for decades by the United States, whose primary beneficiaries are America's biggest rival and its closest Asian allies. Everyone's prosperity routed through everyone else's vulnerability. That arrangement did not happen by accident. It was built, layer by layer, empire by empire, over 5 centuries. And it began with a Portuguese admiral who understood something about this water that every superpower since has had to relearn. There was an old Persian saying repeated by traders for centuries: if all the world were a golden ring, Hormuz would be the jewel upon it. In the 1500s, that wasn't poetry. It was accounting. The island kingdom of Hormuz, sitting in the mouth of the strait, was one of the richest city-states on Earth. It produced almost nothing. It didn't need to. Every cargo of silk, pearls, spices, and horses moving between India, Persia, Arabia, and Africa passed its harbor, and the kingdom took its cut. Then, in 1507, a Portuguese fleet appeared on the horizon, commanded by Afonso de Albuquerque, a man with a strategic vision so cold and so clear it still gets taught in war colleges. Albuquerque had realized that Portugal, a small country of perhaps 1 million people, could never conquer the vast markets of Asia. But it didn't have to. All it had to do was seize the handful of narrow passages that Asian trade squeezed through. Malacca in the east, Aden at the mouth of the Red Sea, and Hormuz in the Gulf. Control the choke points, and you tax a continent without governing it. He seized Hormuz in 1507 and secured it permanently by 1515. For the next century, every ship passing the strait bought a Portuguese license, a cartaz, or risked being sunk by Portuguese cannon. It was, in essence, a protection racket with a flag, and it worked. The customs house of Hormuz became one of the crown's great revenue machines. Note what Portugal did not do. It did not conquer Persia. It did not colonize the Gulf shore. It held one fortified island and a fleet, and that was enough. That model, minimal territory, maximum leverage, is the original operating system of the Strait of Hormuz, and every power since has run some version of it. But the Portuguese also discovered the model's fatal flaw, the one that would eventually catch up with all their successors. A choke point empire looks invincible right up until the moment a stronger fleet shows up, and then it evaporates overnight, because it was never rooted in the land around it. For Portugal, that moment came in 1622. A Persian army under Shah Abbas, allied crucially with the ships of a new player called the English East India Company, took the island fortress and threw the Portuguese out. The lesson was recorded in the ledgers of 3 continents. Whoever holds the strait holds the money, and the strait can change hands in a single campaign. The English, who had just helped decide the matter, took note. They would spend the next 300 years making sure they were on the right side of that equation. Britain ran the Gulf differently from Portugal, quieter, cheaper, and far more durable. Instead of one great stone fortress, the British built an architecture of paper. Between 1820 and 1892, they signed a lattice of treaties with the small Arab sheikdoms of the coast. Truces at sea, which is why the region became known as the Trucial Coast. The rulers kept their thrones and their internal affairs. Britain took control of their foreign relations and, above all, of the water. Piracy was suppressed, rival empires were excluded, and the Royal Navy became the strait's unpaid, or rather indirectly paid, traffic police. For most of the 19th century, the prize was position, not cargo. Hormuz mattered because it guarded the sea road to British India, the most valuable colonial possession on the planet. The Gulf itself was a backwater of pearls and dates. Then, in 1908, at a place called Masjed Soliman in southwestern Persia, a drilling crew that was weeks from being ordered home struck oil, the first commercial discovery in the Middle East. Within 6 years, the British government had bought a controlling stake in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, and Winston Churchill had converted the Royal Navy from coal to oil. Read that sequence again because it's the hinge of the entire century. The world's dominant navy now ran on a substance that came, increasingly, from the shores of the Gulf, through a strait it already controlled with treaties written before anyone knew the oil existed. Strategic luck on that scale changes the definition of a place. Hormuz stopped being a toll gate on the road to India and became something new, the valve on the engine of industrial civilization. Decade by decade, the discoveries stacked up. Iraq, Bahrain, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, each field larger than the last, and the strait's importance compounded like interest. Through two world wars, the Gulf's oil moved out through Hormuz under British protection, and the arrangement was so stable that almost nobody outside the Foreign Office ever thought about it. Control had become invisible, which is what perfected control looks like. But paper empires have operating costs, and by the 1960s, Britain could no longer pay them. Bankrupted by war debt and retreating from colony after colony, London announced in 1968 a decision that stunned even its own allies. Britain would withdraw all military forces east of Suez. The sheikdoms it had protected for 150 years, the future United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Qatar, would be independent within 3 years. The most valuable waterway on Earth was about to lose its policemen. The question of who would inherit the job had several candidates, and one of them wasn't a Western power at all. It was the empire on the Strait's own northern shore, and it had been waiting 400 years for this. On November 30th, 1971, one day before Britain's protection treaties expired, and 2 days before the United Arab Emirates declared independence, Iranian Marines landed on 3 small islands near the mouth of the strait: Abu Musa and the Greater and Lesser Tumbs. The islands were claimed by the Emirates of Sharjah and Ras Al Khaimah. It didn't matter. The Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, wanted physical possession of the strait's approaches, and he took it in a single morning, while the old policeman was walking out the door and the new one hadn't yet hung up his coat. The UAE protests that seizure to this day. The timing was not impulsive, it was the whole point. The Shah had watched Britain's retreat and understood that the Gulf was about to become, for the first time since 1622, a Persian lake, if he moved fast enough to make it one. And remarkably, Washington agreed. Mired in Vietnam, the United States had no appetite for inheriting Britain's garrisons. Under the Nixon Doctrine, America would instead arm regional partners to police regions on its behalf. In the Gulf, that meant 2 pillars: Saudi Arabia and, above all, the Shah's Iran. What followed was one of the great arms transfers in history. Through the 1970s, Iran was allowed to buy essentially anything in the American catalog, short of nuclear weapons. F-14 fighters that even most NATO allies couldn't get. Destroyers, hovercraft for island assaults, the largest fleet of military helicopters in the region. Oil paid for all of it, especially after 1973, when the Arab embargo quadrupled prices and turned the Shah's treasury into a fire hose. By mid-decade, Iran's military budget had grown roughly tenfold in 10 years. Notice the irony quietly assembling itself. The United States, terrified of Soviet influence and unwilling to station its own forces in the Gulf, was building a local superpower on the northern shore of Hormuz, handing the strait's custody to Tehran and calling it a bargain. American admirals toasted their Iranian counterparts aboard ships whose successors now hunt each other in those same waters. The capabilities Iran uses today to threaten the strait, the naval bases at Bandar Abbas, the island garrisons, the institutional memory of controlling Hormuz, were founded, funded, and in many cases literally built under an American security umbrella. For 8 years, the arrangement looked like genius. The oil flowed, the Soviets stayed out, and no American soldier stood watch in the Gulf. Then, in the space of 12 months, the entire structure burned down. And the fire started not in the strait, but in the streets of Tehran. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 didn't just topple a king. It deleted the foundation of American strategy in the world's most important energy region overnight. The twin pillar wasn't merely gone. It had been replaced by a revolutionary state whose founding narrative was opposition to the United States. And before Washington could even process that loss, the second shock landed. In December 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, putting the Red Army 600 kilometers closer to the warm water Gulf that Russian strategists had coveted for 2 centuries. The American response was delivered by a president remembered as a peacemaker, in a sentence that still governs the region today. In his State of the Union address on January 23, 1980, Jimmy Carter declared that any attempt by an outside force to gain control of the Persian Gulf region would be regarded as an assault on the vital interests of the United States. and would be repelled, in his words, by any means necessary, including military force. One sentence drafted in the shadow of Soviet tanks that committed American blood to the free flow of Gulf oil. Analysts gave it a name: the Carter Doctrine. Consider what that sentence actually did. For the first time, the United States formally designated a body of water on the other side of the planet as a vital national interest, the kind of language previously reserved for Allied homelands. The commitment was aimed at Moscow, an outside force. But doctrines outlive their targets. The machinery built to enforce it, a rapid deployment force that in 1983 became Central Command, the military headquarters that today runs every American operation from Egypt to Pakistan, would end up pointed not at the Soviet Union, but at a local power, the revolutionary government on the Strait's northern shore. The economic logic underneath the doctrine was brutally simple. By 1980, the industrialized world had lived through two oil shocks in 7 years, 1973 and 1979, each of which had produced inflation, recession, and political chaos across the West. The lesson written into every Western treasury was that interruptions of Gulf oil don't stay in the Gulf. They arrive within weeks in every supermarket and every election in the developed world. So the United States did what Portugal and Britain had done before it. It made the Strait its business permanently. American warships began continuous patrols. The Fifth Fleet would eventually be reactivated, headquartered in Bahrain, a few hundred kilometers up the coast where it remains today. And almost immediately the new guarantee was put to the test. Not by the Soviets, but by an 8-year bloodbath between Iran and Iraq that turned the Strait itself into a shooting gallery. The world was about to find out what defending 21 miles of water actually costs. Between 1984 and 1988, in the shadow of the Iran-Iraq War, the Persian Gulf hosted the largest sustained assault on commercial shipping since the Second World War, and most people alive today have never heard of it. Lloyd's of London counted roughly 450 ships attacked. Iraq struck first, using jets and missiles against tankers carrying Iran's oil, trying to bankrupt Tehran's war effort. Iran answered against ships serving Iraq's financiers, Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, with mines, speedboat raids, and eventually missiles of its own. Hundreds of civilian sailors, men from India, the Philippines, South Korea, and a dozen other nations who had signed up to haul cargo, were killed in the crossfire. The escalation followed a pattern worth memorizing, because it is precisely the pattern playing out in 2026. Attacks raised insurance premiums, premiums raised freight costs, costs drew in outside navies. In 1987, Kuwait made Washington an offer that transformed the war. It asked the United States to reflag Kuwaiti tankers as American ships, wrapping Gulf oil in the stars and stripes. Operation Earnest Will became the largest naval convoy operation since 1945. On its very first run, the reflagged supertanker Bridgerton struck an Iranian mine, a $12 weapon by some accounts, disabling a ship the U.S. Navy was escorting with warships worth billions. Then, in April 1988, the frigate USS Samuel B. Roberts hit a mine that nearly broke it in half. Navy divers recovered other mines nearby bearing Iranian serial numbers. The American reprisal, Operation Praying Mantis, was the largest surface naval battle the U.S. Navy had fought since World War II. In a single day, April 18, 1988, it destroyed 2 Iranian oil platforms used as military posts, sank a missile boat and a frigate, and crippled another frigate. Iran's conventional navy was effectively knocked out of the war in an afternoon. On the surface, a decisive American victory, and that's how the Pentagon's histories record it. But look closer, because the tanker war wrote both sides' playbooks. The United States learned that it could destroy Iran's navy at will. Iran learned the mirror lesson: never again fight the Americans ship to ship. Its navy split in two, a conventional fleet for parades and diplomacy, and a swarm of small, fast, cheap weapons under the Revolutionary Guard, speedboats, mobile missile batteries hidden along the coast, and mines. Weapons designed not to defeat a superpower's navy, but to make an insurance actuary sweat. And through all 4 years of it, this is the number that mattered most, the Strait never closed. Oil kept flowing, prices barely moved, because the one thing neither combatant dared do was shut the door completely. The world absorbed a comforting conclusion. Hormuz bends, but it doesn't break. That conclusion would hold for 38 years, and it might have held longer, if not for what happened in those same waters in the war's final summer. 3 minutes that Iran has never forgotten. On the morning of July 3, 1988, Iran Air Flight 655 lifted off from Bandar Abbas Airport for a 28-minute hop across the strait to Dubai. It was a scheduled civilian flight flown daily inside a recognized commercial air corridor. Aboard were 290 people, 66 of them children. Directly beneath that corridor, the USS Vincennes, one of the most advanced warships on Earth carrying the new Aegis radar system, was in a running gun battle with Iranian speedboats. 7 minutes after takeoff, the Vincennes fired 2 missiles and destroyed the aircraft. The crew had identified the Airbus A300, climbing on-schedule transponder on, as an F-14 fighter descending to attack. Every soul on board died. The official U.S. investigation attributed the disaster to crew error under combat stress, a phenomenon it called scenario fulfillment. Trained for an attack, the operators saw the attack their training expected in data that showed something else. The United States eventually paid $61.8 million to the victims' families in a 1996 settlement at the International Court of Justice. It expressed regret. It never issued a formal apology, and the ship's captain was later decorated for his overall service. Facts that Iranians cite to this day. Set aside for a moment every argument about blame, and look at what the event revealed about the strait itself. Hormuz is so narrow, so crowded, and so saturated with weapons that the distance between routine and catastrophe is measured in seconds and misread pixels. A civilian airliner and a naval battle occupied the same few miles of sky and sea. In these waters, the margin for error is functionally zero, and everyone operating there knows it. The downing of Flight 655 became load-bearing in Iranian strategic thinking. It is taught, commemorated, and cited as proof of a specific proposition, that the American guarantee of the strait is, from Tehran's shore, indistinguishable from an American occupation of Iran's front porch, one that can kill 290 civilians and pay its way out. You do not need to accept that framing to recognize its power. Nations, like people, are shaped less by what happens to them than by the stories they build from it. Weeks later, exhausted, Iran accepted a ceasefire with Iraq. The tanker war ended. The Gulf went quiet, American supremacy at sea looked absolute, and the strait settled into what looked like permanent stability. What it actually settled into was a 30-year rehearsal, a ritualized, almost choreographed cycle of threat and response that both sides would perform over and over, right up until the morning in 2026, when one of them stopped performing. From 1988 to 2024, the Strait of Hormuz ran on an unwritten script, and once you learn it, you can date almost any Gulf crisis by which line was being delivered. It opens with pressure on Iran, usually sanctions. Iran threatens to close the strait. Oil prices tick upward. The United States repositions a carrier group and declares the threat unacceptable. There are incidents: a tanker seized, a drone downed, mines that officially belong to no one. Insurance premiums spike. And then before the door actually shuts, both sides step back. Because the door shutting serves neither of them. Curtain, reset. Wait for the next act. The performances were sometimes spectacular. In 2011 and 2012, as oil sanctions tightened, Iranian officials threatened closure outright, and a naval standoff followed. In May and June 2019, after the United States tried to force Iran's oil exports to zero, 6 tankers were damaged by limpet mines near the strait's approaches. That June, Iran shot down an American Global Hawk surveillance drone, a $130 million aircraft, and the U.S. president ordered a retaliatory strike, then canceled it with roughly 10 minutes to spare. That July, Revolutionary Guard commandos rappelled from a helicopter onto a British-flagged tanker, the Stena Impero, and sailed it to Bandar Abbas, 2 weeks after Britain had seized an Iranian tanker off Gibraltar. As recently as April 2024, Iranian forces boarded and took the container ship MSC Ares near the strait. Yet through every act of the play, the oil moved. And the reason it moved is the single most important mechanism in this entire story. Closing Hormuz would bankrupt Iran first. Roughly 90% of Iran's own oil exports load at Karg Island, inside the Gulf behind the very door Iran threatens to slam. And in the sanctions era, those exports go overwhelmingly to exactly one customer: China, buyer of some 90% of Iranian crude, and simultaneously the Strait's single biggest beneficiary. Iran threatening to close Hormuz was a man threatening to burn down a building while standing in its lobby, holding a lease. So the threat's real function was never execution, it was pricing. Every crisis reminded the world, and the oil market, that a fifth of global supply lived behind a door only Iran could credibly menace, which gave a heavily sanctioned mid-sized economy the diplomatic weight of a superpower. Analysts called it the Hormuz premium. It was leverage, refined to its purest form. Value extracted not from doing, but from being permanently able to do. Every ritual, though, depends on both actors caring more about the theater than the fire. Strip one side of its stake in the status quo, say by convincing it that the alternative to risk is extinction, and the script stops protecting anyone. In June 2025, the world got a preview of exactly that, and largely misread it as one more performance. It was actually the dress rehearsal. On June 13, 2025, Israel launched a surprise air campaign against Iran. Nuclear facilities, missile bases, and a stunning sequence of assassinations that reached deep into the military command. For 12 days, the two countries traded fire across 1,000 kilometers. And on June 22nd, the United States joined directly. B-2 stealth bombers flew from Missouri and dropped 14G Bu-57 bunker busters, 30,000-pound bombs designed for exactly 3 targets on Earth, on the enrichment sites at Fordo and Natanz, while submarine-launched cruise missiles struck Isfahan. Operation Midnight Hammer was the largest B-2 strike ever flown. Within hours, Iran's parliament voted to close the Strait of Hormuz. Headlines flashed worldwide. Brent crude jumped toward the low 80s. But the vote was constitutionally advice. The actual decision belonged to the Supreme National Security Council. And the council did what the ritual predicted: nothing. Iran's retaliation was a telegraphed missile salvo against an American airbase in Qatar, so carefully choreographed that not one person died. Within 48 hours, a ceasefire was announced. Oil prices didn't just fall, they collapsed below their pre-war level as traders concluded the whole thing had been theater after all. Look at what each side took home from those 12 days, though, because the two lessons were incompatible, and their collision produced 2026. Washington's lesson? Iran is a paper tiger. Its air defenses were dismantled in days, its proxies barely moved, its dreaded strait never closed. Military action against Iran, long considered the third rail of Middle East policy, now looked cheap. Tehran's lesson was the mirror image. Restraint had purchased nothing. Playing by the script, the symbolic salvo, the unexecuted threat, had left its nuclear program in rubble and its commanders in graves. The next war, Iranian planners concluded, could not be answered with theater. Through the autumn and winter of 2025, both sides acted on their lessons. Western intelligence tracked Iranian mine stockpiles being dispersed to hardened coastal sites. The Revolutionary Guard drilled swarm attacks and rehearsed in public exercises exactly one scenario: denying the strait. Meanwhile in Washington, planning hardened around a conviction that one more decisive blow could end the Iranian problem permanently. Two governments studying the same 12 days had each concluded the other was bluffing. The fuse met the powder on February 28, 2026. In the opening minutes of Operation Epic Fury, American and Israeli strikes killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei himself, along with dozens of officials around him. The first time in modern history a head of state of a major nation was assassinated from the air by another state. Whatever else that decision accomplished, it settled an internal Iranian argument that had run for 40 years. The faction arguing that closing the strait would be suicide lost the debate in a single night. There was no longer a status quo to protect. Within hours, the Revolutionary Guard was on the radio, and the door, and for the first time in 500 years of continuous commerce, began to swing shut. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz did not look like a battle. There was no fleet stretched across the channel, no chain pulled taut between fortresses. It arrived as a voice on Marine FI-HF radio, broadcasting from Revolutionary Guard stations to every ship in the strait. Passage is forbidden. Proceed at your own risk. Modern commerce is built on the calculation of risk, and that sentence detonated the calculation. Tanker traffic fell 70% in the first days of March. Some ships raced through in the dark, most turned back or froze at anchor. Then came the demonstrations, engineered for maximum effect at minimum cost. On March 1st, the tanker Skylight was hit by a projectile off the Omani coast. 2 crew members died. The same day, a drone boat slammed into the MKDV Yom, setting the engine room ablaze. A U.S.-flagged tanker was struck twice while docked in Bahrain. On March 4th, a sea drone exploded against the Sonangol Namibe at anchor off Kuwait, 800 kilometers from the strait, a message that nowhere in the Gulf was out of reach. Over the following weeks, more than 24 commercial vessels were hit by drones, missiles, gunboats, and mines, from Basra to Dubai. Crews died on ships flagged to Palau, the Marshall Islands, Thailand. On March 10th, U.S. intelligence confirmed Iran was seeding the strait with naval mines. The Navy announced it had destroyed 16 mine-laying boats. GPS signals across the strait dissolved into spoofed nonsense, leaving even neutral ships unsure of their own positions. But the decisive strike was delivered by men in office chairs in London. On March 5th, the marine insurance market withdrew war risk coverage for the strait entirely. No cover, no cargo. A $2 billion supertanker cannot legally or financially move without insurance. Analysts summarized the new reality in one sentence. The strait is technically open and effectively closed. Iran had discovered what Albuquerque knew in 1507. You don't need to stop every ship. You need to make passage unpriceable. On March 4th, the Revolutionary Guard declared it controlled the strait. And in a detail that tells you the 20th century is over, its officers began granting passage selectively. Ships broadcasting China owner on their transponders slipped through. A Turkish-operated gas carrier announced itself as Muslim-owned and was waved past. By late March, Tehran had published, in effect, a guest list. Vessels of China, Russia, India, Iraq, and Pakistan could apply for transit. The ships of the United States, Israel, and their allies could not. Iran, mid-war, its leader dead, its cities under bombardment, had done something no defeated-looking state is supposed to be able to do. It had converted the world's most important waterway into an instrument of policy. The military logic was asymmetric warfare. The economic logic was older. Much older. It was the Customs House of Hormuz, reopened after 400 years under new management. And the bill for the world economy was about to come due. The numbers from March 2026 will be cited in economics textbooks for 50 years. Brent crude crossed $100 on March 8th, the first time in 4 years, and kept climbing to a peak of 126. Dubai crude, the benchmark for the oil Asia actually buys, touched $166, the highest price ever recorded. March 2026 saw the largest one-month increase in oil prices in the history of the market, steeper than the Gulf War, steeper than Ukraine. The International Energy Agency called it the biggest disruption to world energy supply since the 1970s. Others dropped the qualifier and called it the biggest period. Behind the prices, physical reality was worse. This wasn't an embargo where oil exists but someone won't sell it. The oil physically could not leave. Roughly 10 million barrels a day of production came off the market. Within the Gulf, loaded supertankers piled up like aircraft in a holding pattern. 230 of them by early April, by the count of Abu Dhabi's national oil company. 20,000 merchant sailors were trapped with their ships. Iraq began shutting down its southern oil fields. Output at its main fields fell 70%. For the simplest of reasons. The storage tanks were full, and no tanker could come to drain them. Qatar Energy stopped LNG production and declared force majeure. Kuwait declared force majeure. Saudi Arabia cut production by a fifth. The Gulf, which had spent 70 years selling reliability, spent March 2026 telling its customers, in legal language, that reliability was suspended until further notice. The shock then traveled down every pipe in the global economy, including ones few people knew existed. European natural gas prices doubled within a week. Gasoline in California crossed $5. The Gulf produces nearly half the world's traded urea. Fertilizer prices jumped 50% within a month, threatening planting seasons and food prices into 2027. A third of the world's helium MRI machines, semiconductor fabs, sat behind the blockade. Even the American defense industry discovered that its supply of sulfur, the unglamorous input beneath munitions and mining, ran through Hormuz. 32 nations of the International Energy Agency authorized the release of 400 million barrels from strategic reserves, the largest coordinated release ever, and it bought the world about 4 days of consumption. And the famous alternatives? They performed exactly as the fine print always said they would. Saudi Arabia's east-west pipeline to the Red Sea, the UAE's line to Fujairah, Iraq's route through Turkey, combined theoretical capacity about 9 million barrels a day against the 20 the strait normally carries, and every barrel of it emerging into seas patrolled by other threats. The Houthis had resumed Red Sea attacks on day one of the war, pushing shipping around the Cape of Good Hope. Drones struck Oman's supposedly safe ports of Duqm and Salalah. London's insurance market simply drew its high-risk zone larger. The world learned in real time and at retail prices that there has never been a plan B for the Strait of Hormuz. There is only the strait and whoever holds it. By April, with the world economy bleeding and a temporary ceasefire nominally in place, Iran unveiled the endgame it had apparently intended all along. It did not keep the strait sealed. It priced it. Ships from approved nations could transit, for a fee reported at over $1 million per vessel, with at least one tanker paying $2 million to use a new Iranian-controlled channel routed north of Larak Island, inside Iranian waters, under Iranian escort. According to Lloyd's List, the Revolutionary Guard assessed the payments in Chinese yuan. An Iranian parliamentary committee began drafting the arrangement into law. Hostile flags barred, everyone else pays. The customs house of Hormuz was no longer a metaphor. The world's responses ran the full spectrum of impotence. The United Nations Security Council took up a resolution demanding safe passage. Russia and China vetoed it. 50 countries convened in London to plan a reopening. France and Britain assembled a defensive multilateral mission. Germany, Spain, Italy, and others declined to send ships into the strait itself. India's navy escorted Indian-flagged carriers as far as the Gulf of Oman, and, tellingly, no farther. Even Ukraine offered advice, having kept its own Black Sea corridor open under Russian fire. Analysts calculated that escorting even 3 or 4 commercial ships a day through the strait would tie down 7 or 8 destroyers indefinitely. The entire surface strength of most navies on Earth committed to a single traffic lane. Washington's answer came in stages, each stage revealing how few good options remained. First, ultimatums. Reopen within 48 hours or face obliteration, which came, went, and were extended. Then, on April 11th, U.S. destroyers entered the strait for the first time since the war began, sweeping for mines. According to one report, Iran had by then lost track of some of its own minefields, meaning the strait could no longer be fully reopened even by its closer. And when talks in Islamabad collapsed, the United States crossed a line it had avoided for 46 years of confrontation with Iran. It declared a naval blockade of Iranian ports, intercepting Iran's own oil exports, including explicitly ships that had paid Tehran's tolls. Pause on the resulting geometry, because history has rarely produced anything like it. Iran blockading the Gulf from within, America blockading Iran from without, 2 sieges superimposed on the same 21 miles. Maritime lawyers pointed out correctly that Iran's closure violated the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and that mining a commercial strait breaches conventions dating to 1907. Iran's jurists pointed out just as correctly that it had never ratified that convention, and its diplomats asked, with documented cases in hand, what law had governed the annihilation of its leadership from the sky. The American UN ambassador declared that no country gets to hold the world hostage just because it happens to sit next to a strait. Tehran's reply, in effect, sitting next to the strait is the one card we were dealt, and it is being played. Beneath the noise, though, the sharpest observers were watching Beijing, the largest buyer of Gulf oil, the largest buyer of Iranian oil, the holder of 1 billion barrels in reserve, and the one power whose ships transited unmolested in both directions. China vetoed the West's resolution counseled restraint on all sides, kept its yuan flowing through the toll booth, its own currency now denominated. And in April, moved on a disputed shoal in the South China Sea, while the U.S. Navy was looking the other way. Whatever the Strait of Hormuz becomes when this ends, one capital had positioned itself to profit from every version of the outcome. Which brings us to now, July 2026, and the question this entire story has been circling. Who controls the Strait of Hormuz today? Walk through the past 6 weeks and try to answer. On June 17th, after mediation by Pakistan and others, a memorandum to end the war was signed by the American president at Versailles, of all places, and by Iran's president in Tehran, with 60 days to negotiate final terms. For about 3 weeks it held. Tankers began creeping back. Then, on July 8th, ships were hit again in the strait. Washington blamed Tehran and struck Iranian territory. Iran answered against American bases in the Gulf. On July 11th, the Revolutionary Guard declared the strait closed, in its words, until further notice. The United States demanded Iran publicly declare it open and hit roughly 140 targets across a single night. Missile sites, drone stations, naval facilities, coastal radars. And the strait itself? Last Sunday, July 12th, exactly 6 vessels transited a waterway that used to see 100 a day. Brent sits near $79, elevated but nowhere near March's 126, because the market has spent 4 months doing what markets do: adapting, rerouting, demand destroying, and pricing a permanent Hormuz risk premium into the cost of everything. Read that calm carefully, though. It is not the calm of a solved problem. It is the calm of a world quietly learning to assume the strait cannot be trusted, which, for the Gulf states whose entire economic model is trustworthy export, may be the most expensive sentence ever written about them. So, who controls it? Iran can deny the strait, demonstrably, indefinitely, but cannot use it, sail it freely, or export through it. Its own lifeline to China runs through waters America now patrols as a blockade. The United States can punish any Iranian action within hours. But a year of the world's most expensive military power has not produced the one thing that actually matters, which is tankers moving on schedule without a war risk surcharge. The insurers of London hold a quiet veto neither navy can override. And China holds the deepest leverage of all, over Iran's only revenue, over the toll system's currency, over the diplomatic cover that keeps Tehran unisolated, and has declined so far to spend it on anyone's behalf but its own. 500 years of this waterway's history, and the pattern has never once broken. Portugal taxed the strait until a stronger coalition removed it. Britain policed it until the cost of empire came due. America guaranteed it until the guarantee met an adversary willing to burn the commons rather than lose. Each master looked permanent. Each handover looked impossible until it was complete. What makes 2026 different is not that control is changing hands. It's that for the first time since Albuquerque's fleet crested the horizon, control is in the water with no hand reaching down to claim it. 4 vetoes, 0 owners. The Strait of Hormuz has become something the modern world has never actually had to live with. A great power vacuum, 21 miles wide, with a fifth of the world's energy on the wrong side of it. Which leaves one question, the one that decides what your energy costs and much else for the next decade. What happens if this is not a crisis at all, but the new system? Consider, as a closing exercise, the conditional futures. Because from July 2026, they fork hard. If the ceasefire is somehow rebuilt and passage restored under international escort, the strait still does not return to February 27th. The precedent now exists, priced and proven. A choke point state under existential attack will close the door, and the world's combined navies could not reopen it in under 5 months. Every actuarial table, every refinery siting decision, every strategic reserve target from Tokyo to Rotterdam now carries that memory. The Hormuz premium becomes permanent, a standing tax on a fifth of the world's energy, collected by nobody and paid by everybody. If instead the toll system survives in any form, if ships keep paying 7 figures for escorted passage through Iranian water, then something far larger than an oil route has changed. The foundational bargain of the modern economy, in place since 1945, is that the sea is free and its choke points are guaranteed by overwhelming disinterested power. What happens if that bargain is shown to be optional? There are 8 or 9 choke points on Earth in the Strait's weight class: Malacca, Bab el-Mandeb, Suez, Gibraltar, Panama. Every one of them now has a coastline, a grievance, and a case study. A world of told choke points is a world where geography collects rent again. Everywhere. Something closer to the 16th century than to the 20th. Albuquerque's model, it turns out, was never obsolete. It was dormant, waiting for the guarantor to blink. And if the war reignites in full, the scenario every energy minister wargames, and none will discuss on the record, the last 5 months become a preview at 1/10th scale. March 2026 subtracted 10 million barrels a day for weeks and delivered record prices, force majeure across 4 nations, and fertilizer shocks reaching into 2027's food supply. A full-year interruption is the kind of event that reorders governments on 5 continents. That sentence is not a prediction. It is the reason 6,000 miles of ocean away from the strait, and capitals that could not place it on a map 30 years ago, it now sits at the top of every national security review. Here is the thread to keep. For 5 centuries, the Strait of Hormuz has been the world's most honest mirror. Whoever truly holds power at sea holds Hormuz. And the moment they no longer can, the transition of eras has already happened, whether or not anyone has announced it. Portugal's flag, Britain's treaties, America's fleet. The mirror is currently showing us something no living analyst has ever seen in it: an interregnum. The age when a single power guaranteed the world's arteries has ended in the one place where it matters most, and whatever replaces it, an American restoration, a negotiated condominium, a Chinese brokered order, a permanent toll, will be the first draft of how the next world actually works. If this story sharpened how you see the map, consider following the boardroom. These are exactly the stories we work on. Power, money, and the infrastructure both travel through. Share it with someone who still thinks oil prices move on their own, and tell us in the comments which strait, cable, canal, or choke point you want investigated next. Because just after midnight on March 2nd, 2026, the screens over the world's most important waterway went dark. And 5 months later, every light that has come back on is running on someone's permission. The only question that matters now is whose.